What's up, everybody? This is your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga, here to bring you another video with no frills, just the analysis. And today I'm here to bring you the Season 5, Episode 2 review of Samurai Jack entitled XCIII, otherwise known as 93 in Roman numerals. Wow. This episode was very heavy. First things first. I heard a couple of things before I actually watched this episode. The first was that Aku's voice was kind of messed up. A lot of people were complaining about how his voice didn't sound anything like Old Boy. I just refer to him as Old Boy because I can never remember the name of the voice actor of Aku. So I just refer to him as Old Boy. The second one was a spoiler. I was actually spoiled in this episode about the shocking death that occurred. But even though I heard some things that caused me some trepidations about this episode, in the end, everything was okay. And even though I was spoiled about the daughter of Aku's death, it still hit very hard. Also, before I get into a review of this episode, a couple of things. First is, this series has a remarkable attention to detail, and it uses that detail for great thematic effect in terms of creating motifs across seasons, but also across individual episodes as well. And one of the important details that I noticed watching the opening sequence of this episode was when Jack breathes, his breath takes the form or the shape of Aku. And this was a very important visual metaphor for this episode, because it's almost as if Aku is some type of invasive disease, that it has somehow infiltrated Jack's very physical being, and now he inhales and exhales Aku. And this has a very important implications in terms of Aku being, in a very real sense, a psychological and emotional disease for Jack. And like I said, this visual metaphor has very important implications for this episode in particular. So this episode was structured by two very important instances of parallelism. For those of you who don't know, parallelism is a literary device that has similarity in structure between one thing and another thing. It could be conceptual parallelism, as was the case in this episode, or it could be at the level of text. So a very famous instance of parallelism is the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not X. Thou shalt not X. So the thou shalt not at the beginning of the clause is a very famous instance of parallelism from the Bible. That's also epistrophe, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's the correct word, but it's also parallelism. So, first let's talk about the opening sequence, when Aku wakes up. So I speculated in the last episode that Aku had somehow disappeared because he seemed to not be present when this occult sort of religion of Aku was creating the daughters of Aku to go out and do his bidding and kill Samurai Jack. But that doesn't actually seem to be the case. Aku is still around. And the opening scene is very important because it reveals the psychological interdependence between Jack on the one hand and Aku on the other hand. So what do I mean by that? So the scene opens up with some people coming to pay tribute to Aku. One of those people, or a group of those people, are scientists who have built a new beetle bot. But Aku claims to no longer care about killing Jack, and so he claims that I don't care about your beetle bots because I don't care about Jack anymore. He's no longer a threat. I don't really care about him. And right after this, there's a therapy session, the therapy session scene, which proves that this is not actually the case. So Aku creates a clone of himself that acts as his therapist. And Aku reveals to his therapist self that he thought destroying the time portals would be enough, that eventually Jack would just die off, and the fact that Jack hasn't died is visibly causing him some distress. So it's clear that he does in fact care about the existence of Samurai Jack. And this clone therapy session is just a physical manifestation of his cognitive dissonance. On the one hand, he tells people that he doesn't care about Samurai Jack anymore, but on the other hand, in his therapy session, he clearly does. And so this cognitive dissonance reveals Aku's and Jack's psychological interdependence on each other. Their identities are sustained by their conflict with each other, and this is somewhat unusual in fiction because I don't know if there has been a conflict in fiction where there are two characters who are in conflict with each other, and this conflict goes on pretty much for 5 decades, right? So this isn't just some normal relationship in a story where two people have a conflict with each other and eventually one of them is triumphant. No, this relationship has been dragging on for 50 years. And so, like I said, Aku's therapy session is just a physical representation of his cognitive dissonance and the way in which he is psychologically interdependent on Jack. His self-reflection, the clone of himself, is a representation of his self-reflexivity. And we learn that his self-reflection is mediated by his relationship with Jack. Even though this is supposed to be a safe space, as his therapist says, that's clearly not the case because Jack invades that safe space and causes Aku a considerable amount of distress in the form of cognitive dissonance. And this is the first instance of parallelism because we see that this is also the case for Jack, as was shown in the last episode. Jack apparently has no aspect of his identity that's not tied in some way to his relationship with Aku. This conflict between him and Aku has consumed him to the point of insanity. We saw it in the last episode when during his fight with Scaramouche he starts hallucinating, and we saw it again in this episode where his mental projection of himself is talking to him and is alluding to the fact that maybe this is a good time to end it, that maybe we should commit suicide and just be done with this whole thing. So Jack's psychology, his moral perception of himself is evidenced by the guilt that he feels over the fact that he never defeated Aku and hence never returned to the past. And his entire subjectivity, it seems, is mediated by his relationship with Aku. Everything that Jack thinks about himself is mediated by that relationship. And so his identity is now sustained in a very real way and dependent on this conflict with Aku. And like I said before at the beginning of this episode, that ties into the visual metaphor of Jack's breath in the opening sequence of this episode. I mean, Aku is almost literally a part of Jack now. And like I said, the same is true for Aku. We know this because his morning routine is just a metaphor for normality. And in this case, Aku's normal is waking up, getting updates, going to therapy, where he tries to resolve the cognitive dissonance created by his conflict with Samurai Jack. So this is the first instance of conceptual parallelism in this episode, which was pretty good writing. So now let's talk about the second instance of parallelism which structures this episode. And that's Jack and the wolf, which is a very intriguing piece of parallelism. So on one level, it's a straightforward comparison. There's a lone wolf in a forest, comes to a fork in the road, goes left, and is set upon by his enemies. Then we have, in the very next scene, we have a lone Jack in a forest who comes to a fork in the road, goes left, and is set upon by his enemies. And so the metaphor here is that Jack has become like a feral animal. And indeed, the daughters hunt him like an animal. But the metaphor goes even deeper than that. I mean, the way this episode was structured through parallelism and metaphor and imagery was quite excellent. Like I said, the metaphor goes deeper than this. So Jack is fighting for his sanity and rationality, as we saw when he was running from the daughters of Aku, and he tried to find shelter in the husk of a destroyed Beetlebot. And so he has this mental projection of himself, and so he's talking to himself, which again is another form of parallelism, because just as Aku created a clone of himself to have a moment of self-reflection, in the same way Jack creates a mental projection of himself to have a moment of self-reflection. And so this scene inside the Beetlebot is a symbol for Jack's continuing diminution into basically an animal. Reason and rationality are the things that are supposed to separate humans and animals. And it's our reason and rationality that is also juxtaposed against our emotions. Very important philosophical motif throughout the Western philosophical tradition. But Jack is starting to be emotionally and psychologically overwhelmed. Hence, his allusions to suicide and the extended metaphor of the chase scene. So we have on one level that Jack's reason and rationality is being diminished by his obvious onset of insanity in the form of hallucinations, and also the allusion to suicide. But also the metaphor continues because, as we saw in the chase scene where he comes, I'm not actually sure what it was. It looked like some sort of underground burial site that had all of these coffins. I'm not really sure what it was, but Jack was inside one of these coffins hiding from the daughters of Aku as they were hunting him basically like an animal. And we see when he's inside the coffin that he is overwhelmed by fear and essentially nothing but his survival instinct. And again, fear and survival, those are qualities of an animal. Humans are supposed to be more than the mere sum of their emotions. We're supposed to be more than we're supposed to be about more than surviving. We're supposed to be about living. And somehow throughout the last 50 years, Jack has lost all of this, which has basically reduced him in a lot of ways to a feral animal. And the going out of the light of the firefly inside that coffin represents the continuing transformation of Jack's reduction from a human being into an animal, but it also represents something else, which is, again, the writing here is very, very layered. So the going out of the light of the firefly inside that coffin is also a literary allusion to the myth, the Greek myth. Yeah, it's the Greek myth of Prometheus. So Prometheus was one of the gods who stole fire from Mount Olympus and gave it to the humans. And in Greek mythology, Prometheus stealing the fire and giving it to humans is supposed to represent the beginning of human civilization. It's the beginning of the human fight, and in some sense, turning of the tables against the dark. So where the dark represents humans being animals, they don't have access to fire, they don't know how to cook their food, they don't know how to create light, which again is also an allusion to Plato's allegory of the cave. If you have time, check that out. Our ability to manipulate fire is a symbol of our humanity. However, inside the coffin, the firefly's light goes out, which is a symbol of the fact that Jack is now alienated from civilization. He's not just alienated from himself, but he's alienated from civilization because this is a world that Aku has taken over. So he's not just alienated from himself. He's not just experiencing temporal alienation because of the fact that he's in a time where he's not supposed to be in, but he's also alienated from civilization, the very concept and idea of civilization itself, because in a lot of ways, Aku represents the antithesis of civilization. He represents authoritarianism and a dictator and somebody who has a monopoly on power and is consuming the world for his own base purposes. And the extended metaphor goes even deeper than that. So we've got the parallelism of Jack and the wolf, and we've got the metaphor of how Jack is now becoming more and more like an animal. And we've got this explained in terms of the reduction of his reasoning, of his rationality, and him being overwhelmed psychologically and emotionally by his fear and his survival instinct. And we have all of those things linked to the literary illusion of the Promethean myth, but then the extended metaphor goes deeper than that. It continues. And it continues through something known as physiognomy. So physiognomy is just a fancy word for a literary device where characterization is revealed through the appearance of a character. It can be through certain physical features or characteristics, but it can also be revealed through clothing, etc. Just their general outward appearance as it relates to their characterization. And the extended metaphor continues here for Jack through physiognomy. We've all seen how Jack's animalism is represented by the fact that now his hair has grown out. He looks wild and feral and unkempt. His beard has grown out. So again, he looks wild and feral and unkempt. And this is also related to his wild animal screams during the fight with the daughters of Aku. But it's not just about his hair growing out and his wild animal screams during the fight and about the fact that his beard looks unkempt. It's also noted in a very subtle but significant way. When the fight first starts, Jack is fully clothed. He's got on his boots. He's got on, I'm not really sure what it is, but basically his costume. And in the beginning of the fight, when the daughters of Aku attack him, they're cutting him, they're slicing him, they're punching him, they're kicking him, and slowly but surely, he starts losing his clothing to the point where at the end of the scene, all he has is just the tattered rags around his waist covering up his private parts. And so the longer he's hunted as an animal, the more clothes he loses, and the more clothes he loses, the more he resembles in a physical way an animal. And clothes are again another sign of civilization, just like fire. And of course, this is related to the story in the Bible. I almost called it a myth, but I don't want to offend anybody. The story in the Bible about the Garden of Eden. These clothes are another sign of civilization that Jack is slowly but surely losing throughout this episode. So Jack is being reduced to an animal in every capacity, psychologically, intellectually, emotionally, and by appearance. And the diminution of Jack's humanity eventually culminates in him killing a daughter of Aku. So now let's talk about the death scene. I was pretty shocked by this. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, I was spoiled for this death scene. But even still, I was shocked. So even though I was spoiled, I was shocked. And even though this was foreshadowed in the episode itself, I was still shocked. And here's why. The daughters of Aku are innocent children. They were forced into being child soldiers. They had absolutely no choice in the matter. But of course, Jack doesn't know this. To him, he's just being hunted as an animal, and he's just fighting every way he can possibly fight to retain his survival. And this is an excellent bit of dramatic irony that just increases the tragic moment. The death is not just shocking because the daughter dies, although the death in and of itself is shocking. It's not just shocking because Jack kills her. It's shocking because the dramatic irony of the situation increases the tragedy. Like, Jack doesn't know that the daughter he just killed is in some way completely innocent. I mean, that just increases the tragedy of the situation. And like I always say, fights in narratives, physical fights in narratives, are always expressions of deeper ideological conflicts. And that was definitely the case here. A huge component of the death was, of course, its shock value, but it's carried. The weight of the death is carried by its literary, philosophic, and thematic import. The context surrounding the death is what gives it its significance. The whole fact that that Jack is juxtaposed against the wolf, introducing the metaphor of his reducing humanity and him becoming more animalistic and feral, and all the different layers of the extended metaphor and how that's unpacked. Though that context, the context of the parallelism and the extended metaphor and the imagery, is what gives the culmination of the episode its gravity and its significance. And so I would say that the death was appropriate given the obvious metaphor of Jack's reduction to animalism, and the death was commensurate with the philosophical gravity of the episode. And on top of that, it was properly foreshadowed when Jack was in the husk of that beetle bot, and he's talking about how no matter how many robots Aku sends at me, I'll destroy them. They're just nuts and bolts, which was obvious foreshadowing to the fact that, nah, these new enemies are not just nuts and bolts. They're human beings, and in order to survive, you might have to kill them. Other thoughts on this episode. Aku's voice is really good enough. It's obviously different, but it doesn't detract from the series in any significant way. So I will say that about Aku's voice. So to wrap this episode review up, it was a phenomenal episode. It had excellent uses of parallelism, of extended metaphor, as well as imagery and dramatic irony. It was just a very well written and very well composed episode. I mean, if the writing continues like this for the rest of the season, we are in for a treat, and we might be talking about Samurai Jack, at least season 5, as one of the best seasons we've ever seen in a cartoon, and even the entire series of Samurai Jack. Like, if season 5 turns out to be the crown jewel of what was already a great cartoon series in the first 4 seasons, we could be talking about Samurai Jack as one of the GOAT cartoon series of all time, really. So this was your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga, just brought you another video with no frills, just the analysis. Peace and have a blessed day.